Hello and welcome to the Heaven Bound Sunday School class at the First General Baptist Church in Truman. We're going to read some scripture from chapter 3 of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Now, the book of Daniel depicts the Jewish life in a foreign land after so many people were taken into exile in Babylon. Now, we're going to look at a very familiar passage where three Hebrew exiles felt serving the Lord was worth the risk, no matter what the consequences that might unfold. Now, just give a little brief and concise run up to the scripture that I'm going to read in just a moment. The Babylonians had come in to Judah and taken so many of the Jewish people and took them back to Babylon. And as they were doing that, the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, he had his lieutenants and captains of his army to select many young people who were strong and seemed to have quite a bit of knowledge. And anyway, they were selected and then were going to be trained in various ways to where they could help with the Babylonian government. Now, three such men, of course, were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those were the names that Nebuchadnezzar gave them. And they were the three men I talked about earlier that stood up to King Nebuchadnezzar despite some very possible severe consequences. Now, after the three men and many of the other exiles had been trained to assist people in the government, King Nebuchadnezzar built a tremendously large statue out of gold. It was 90 feet high, 9 feet wide, and he decreed that all people must fall down and worship the image of gold when they heard a certain sound. We won't get into all that, but when they heard this noise, they were supposed to go bow down and worship. Now, failure to do so, they would immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. As time went on and people worshiped this image, people got word to the king and complained that Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, they were not following the orders. They were not going and bowing down and worshiping this huge idol that the king had erected. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was furious, and he confronted the three Jewish men, brought them before him, and asked them directly, was that true? Were they not following his decree? And the scripture tells us, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. And that leads us to the scripture that we're going to discuss. It starts, Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, and their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flames of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, rose up in haste, and spake and said unto his counselors, Did not we cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? And they answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes, the governors, and captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. As we said earlier, the king became furious with the 3 men for their failure to follow his decree. It says he became full of fury. His attitude changed completely, because previously he had liked the 3 men. And he was so mad and so upset about this whole thing, he had his men to make the furnace, if this is even possible, 7 times hotter than it had ever been. Then he had the 3 tied up. I think it even says something about the strongest men of his army. He had them go tie them up, threw them into the furnace. Now think about how hot this furnace was. It was so hot that the men who got near the furnace to throw the 3 into the furnace, they died from the fire. It was so hot. But once this happened, then Nebuchadnezzar, as he's watching from a distance, he's astonished and he's amazed. What's he astonished about? What is he amazed about? He can see 4 men walking within the fire, and he asks his associates, Didn't we throw 3 men in the furnace? Of course, the answer from all his people was affirmative. Yes, there were 3 people thrown in there. But the king said, I see 4 men. They're untied. They're not harmed. And the 4th, or the form of the 4th, is like the Son of God. The king called them the servants of the Most High God. King Nebuchadnezzar, who risked losing his own life to go to the mouth of the furnace and yell for the inhabitants to exit. Now the question is, who is the 4th man? Now, reading, it says, some scholars believe it was the angel Gabriel. Others believe it was the form of God himself, maybe even Jesus. It does not matter whether we know who is in the fire with the faithful servants of God. What matters is that God was faithful to save those who stood up for him. Now, we often focus on the fire-saving miracle, and rightly so, but sometimes we need to have a focus on the character of the 3 young men who honored God, even though it meant death. These young men suffered well because their faith trumped any danger they faced. Now, when the 3 came out, just think about this. The fire had not harmed their bodies in any way. Their hair wasn't singed. Their clothes weren't scorched, and there was no fire or no smell of fire or smoke on them anywhere. Now, the king intended to influence the elite Judean exiles. Instead, these 3 faithful Jewish men influenced Nebuchadnezzar and all the officials gathered around. Because the 3 men had godly character, they witnessed the spiritual figure in the fire and the survival of the men. These faithful 3 did not sin to gain the king's favor. They gained the king's favor after going through the fire by standing up for what they believed and being willing to lose their lives. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego opened the door for God to reveal himself. King Nebuchadnezzar recognized the power of the Hebrew God and proclaimed praises to him. He was so impressed by these young men's faith and God's miracle that the king issued a decree to all the nations under Babylonian rule. Anyone who spoke against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be cut into pieces and their houses torn to rubble. Furthermore, these three faithful servants were promoted to leaders over Babylonian provinces. The three men influenced a foreign king with their faith. Taking time to self-evaluate our character needs to be part of our daily routine so we can impact our world for Christ. We are commanded to influence the culture around us, even if it means being willing to face the consequences of standing for the truth. We too may find that acting in faith, even when risky, influences those around us more than we might ever imagine.